It's the last time I let you see any of the articles I write.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor Emeritus of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Eliot, welcome. Great to have you.
Well, it's, normally, Eric, I really look forward to our weekly session, interviewing interesting people, talking about the issues of the moment. But I got this, kind of cold message on Signal from you about this awful article that I wrote. And I know that I'm going to be taken to the woodshed. And I mean, I've been wrestling with myself, and I'm just going to try to take it like a man. But if I begin sobbing, our listeners will know why.
Well, there's lots to talk about. Since the last time we got together, we of course had just gotten wind of the assassination attempt, the selection of J.D. Vance as the vice presidential candidate. We had the Republican convention last week, so plenty to talk about. But among the other things that dropped was an article you wrote in the Atlantic, which basically said that we, don't worry, be happy. A second Trump term won't be that big a national security catastrophe. And you and I see eye to eye on so much stuff. I think it'll be entertaining, at least for our listeners and viewers, to see us actually disagreeing, because I do disagree with this. But let me start first with where I agree with you. So, number one, I agree that we should not kind of catastrophize everything that goes on. I mean, among other things, that's something that Donald Trump does. Every little thing means, the end of our country, et cetera. And I don't think those of us who are on the other side should do the same. It's important to maintain a sense of proportion, particularly in an era of really overheated rhetoric. So I agree with that. I also agree with another important point you make in the article, which is, as a rule, there is much more continuity between presidential administrations than discontinuity. And every 4 years when we go through our quadrennial, presidential election cycle, there's a lot of rhetoric. And, at the end of the day, you end up seeing a lot of continuity in administrations, in part because, as John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. And the world that different administrations deal with is the same world that their predecessors dealt with, and there are limits to how many degrees of freedom, new administrations have in tackling things. A case in point would be that the national defense strategy of the Biden administration draws very heavily from the 2018 national defense strategy of the Trump administration. So there is lots of continuity. That's where I agree. So, if you want to comment on those areas of agreement.
Draw a line under that and kind of move on to the other topics.
Okay, now we get to the interesting stuff. So I would make, 5 points here about why I disagree with the general thrust of the article. So the article begins by saying, yes, it's possible that Donald Trump will do terrible things to our constitutional order, Project 2025, et cetera. But you then very modestly say, I'm really not, the appropriate person to comment on that. I'm going to, leave that to, constitutional law experts and others, more expert on domestic policy. But the reality, as you and I both know, is it's impossible to disentangle foreign policy from domestic policy. And I think that's particularly true in this instance, in the light of the Supreme Court decision of Trump versus the United States, which has surrounded the president, cosseted the president, particularly President Trump, if he is elected again, in an aura of immunity that has all sorts of implications that we will probably want to discuss, not just on this podcast today, but in future podcasts, for civil military relations and how to military officers deal with potentially illegal orders when the president can't be held legally to account, et cetera. Again, because of Project 2025, there's also a potential, and J.D. Vance has said it, he wants to fire all the civil servants and replace them with reliable political retainers. So kind of the notion that we can just, sort of wall off the domestic side from the foreign policy, I think is probably not correct. Second is Ukraine. You write that there's no sign yet that a second Trump term would dump Ukraine and exit NATO. I guess I would say there, well, while I recognize and I don't disagree that there would be all sorts of institutional impediments, legal impediments to getting out of NATO, any number of his former advisors, John Bolton, Mark Esper, have testified to his desire and will to get out of NATO. Moreover, we have a pretty good idea what he's going to do on Ukraine, because he said, I'm going to settle the war in 48 hours. Keith Kellogg's and Fred Fleitz at the America First Policy Institute have put together a plan, which is on the web, you can read it, for how they would solve Ukraine, which in essence basically threatens to tell Ukraine, negotiate with Putin and give up the territory you've already lost and don't expect to become part of NATO. Viktor Orban, of course, met with Trump at Mar-a-Lago and after meeting with Putin in Moscow, and has basically said that Trump has a plan, and pretty much clear that it's the Kellogg-Fleitz plan. And Putin has said, I'm amenable to that kind of plan. So I think the odds of Trump not, in fact, dumping Ukraine and everything that brings in its wake, which is disastrous for NATO and an encouragement to, naked aggression elsewhere, including in the Indo-Pacific, where Trump has said he wouldn't defend Taiwan, I think is out there. Third point, you say that people are, have said that there won't be adults in the room like there were in the first go round with Mattis and Tillerson and H.R. McMaster and John Kelly, et cetera. But there might be other adults in the room. You say there might be Mike Pompeo or might be Tom Cotton or others, and that, Vance won't play, that big a role. I'll come back in a minute to that. But with regard to Pompeo, Cotton, and others like them who might serve in the administration, first on Pompeo, who gave a thoroughly disgraceful speech at the Republican National Convention, I would point out that he did Trump's bidding. He signed the Doha Agreement that laid the predicate for the disastrous, debacle in Afghanistan. And there's no reason he also, when, Trump went to North Korea, Pompeo basically said the North Korean nuclear problem has gone away. Donald Trump has solved it. So there's, no indication that he and Tom Cotton, if Tom went into the administration, would do anything other than curry Trump's favor, carry his water. And if they didn't, why would anyone think that their fate would be any different than Rex Tillerson or John Kelly or any of the others, Mattis, who served in the first term? On Vance's role, you say, look, the vice presidency traditionally has been, not that important. Vance probably won't play much of a role. He won't be involved in staffing decisions, et cetera. Maybe that's possible. Having worked for a very powerful vice president, my view may be somewhat colored, by that. But, he was selected largely because Don Jr. lobbied his father, among other people, to put Vance on the ticket. Don Jr. has said that if he gets a job in the administration, the job he would like to have is essentially the one that Johnny McEntee had in the end of the first term. That is to say, be in charge of personnel and making sure that all the people who go in are, MAGA Trump loyalists. Vance has said similar things. I think Vance at age 39 would be anticipating inheriting the presidency either in the 4 years of the term or certainly running in 2028, and would be trying to put his own America First MAGA loyalists in as well. Finally, and we can use this after we get done talking about your article, maybe to segue into another discussion. But you do talk about the assassination attempt and say it has, how do you don't know how it's going to change Trump. It led to at least a initial moment of, you, as you put it, of Trumpian grace. With all due respect, my friend, I think that moment of grace lasted for about 20 minutes at the convention before giving rise to, a speech that, indulged in the greatest hits and brought back the late, great Hannibal Lecter, who would love to have you for dinner. So, I guess just color me unpersuaded, but over to you.
This reminds me of, remember early on in COVID, there was one of these cruise ships that had a COVID outbreak. So they're kind of marooned in the middle of nowhere. Or maybe they're marooned at the dock. I forget what it is. And somebody is interviewing this Australian couple, late middle-aged guy, like many cruisers. And they're saying, how are you keeping yourself occupied? He says, oh, it's easy. He said, my wife has been itemizing my faults, and she's not even halfway through. It's after several days. So look, let me, I take many of your points. The reason why I wrote the piece is actually because of your point number one, that we shouldn't catastrophize. And I think there's been a lot of catastrophizing. I think our friend Bret Stephens has made this point repeatedly, and it's not only not helpful, it's actually kind of dangerous because terrible things may happen, but to get everybody in the world completely torqued up with the feeling that this is the apocalypse now is not a good idea. And it also leads to dangerous rhetoric. So I had a real hard disagreement with a friend of mine who's a very experienced individual. He's going on and on about the Republicans being the Nazi party. And I told him, I 10 days before, I'd been at Auschwitz. I said, it's different. It really is different. And as a Jew, I'm telling you, it's different. And what has stunned me is, instead of, because he's a perfectly wonderful human being, instead of saying, I'm terribly sorry, I shouldn't have put it that way. I can understand why you would be sensitive. No, they're just like the Nazis. And I think that's a very dangerous mindset for people to be in. So, so that's first and foremost the main point. That don't catastrophize. Wait and see. And then, the other thing, which I gave up responding to, outraged people writing to me, is I said may. I said could be. That's all I'm saying, is not that don't worry, Trump foreign policy will be fine, or, basically the same as Biden administration. I just say it might. That's all. And I think, that the older I get, and I think particularly in kind of watching all of the political antics around us, I try more and more something that goes against the grain, which is just to cultivate humility about my ability to anticipate the future. So let me go through. So I'll pocket your 2 compliments and then rebut your 5 points.
Okay. On the humility point, though, I would point out that Winston Churchill, who we both admire enormously, famously said of Clement Attlee, a modest little man who has much to be modest about.
Actually, by the way, I'm not entirely sure he said that, because he actually had pretty high regard for Attlee. But there's also another anecdote about him and Attlee going to the
But that's not for mixed company. Yeah,
it's not for.
I know the one you're talking about.
It's not for a family show. I would also say, on the humility front, I mean, you and I have just been right virtually all the time. So
exactly. So there we go.
On the I think that your point about the link between domestic and foreign policy is right, and that, of course, is the area to be alarmed. And I take the point about the Supreme Court, although, again, you need to remind people what it says: the president can't be prosecuted for things which are within, his official responsibilities. They didn't say he can walk into the middle of the street with a machete and behead somebody. I mean, and it's basically the same standard. Now, it tilted more in Trump's direction, no question about it. But there again, I think people have said, this is a license to kill. It's not. The question is, what are his official responsibilities? I'd also say the other Supreme Court decision, and I'm blocking on the name of the case, is there's a limit to what you can do with executive orders.
Yeah, this is the Loper decision on
Yeah.
the Chevron,
And which I think is the Chevron decision, exactly,
yeah.
which is actually a very good thing. Because, I don't like the idea that the president can, with the stroke of his pen, say, okay, all those student loans forgiven. And I think that would end up, given the amount of litigation that you'd be going through, I think you would find very quickly that Chevron would apply to them as well. Ukraine is the thing, I do worry about most. Although, in the facts are stubborn things department, I would point out, okay, so MAGA Republicans passed the $60 billion aid package. It was a MAGA speaker, Mike Johnson, who steered it through, and he had Trump's acquiescence, which I think is interesting. It's also, you talked about Orban. Yeah, he also had spent an hour with Boris Johnson at the convention when presumably he had other things to do. And we know what, I give Boris Johnson a lot of credit, by the way, for rolling in on him. And I think some of my other arguments might apply. I also tend to think, this is just speculation, that Putin will find it much harder to play him than in the past for a bunch of reasons. Whereas as I said in the piece, if the Ukrainians are smart, they'll send General Budanov to talk to Trump because Trump likes killers. On the Cotton Pompeo thing, I agree. Although I will confess, I smiled a little when you mentioned Doha, that terrible agreement. Well, Biden just, pulled up stakes and moved out.
But
So
you don't have to. Don't get me started on the Biden administration and Afghanistan, because I'll probably have a meltdown in the show, because I still get, and
of course I'm with
Niagara Falls. Slowly I turned step by step.
I mean, the thing, this, in the sad way, this is the continuity. I mean, Biden has not had people around him who could challenge him. Something you and I have talked about often. The difference is not that Trump will have people around him who could challenge him. He'll have people around him who I think will be better at manipulating him. And I think Cotton in particular, if he comes in, that's good. Now, as I said in the piece, you could get Mike Flynn, and then, as
or Rick Grinnell, or
Kash Patel, as my grandmother would say. In that case, oy vey vey. On Vance, again, this is pure speculation. But I think there are two reasons why I think Trump will turn on. First, Trump turns on everybody around him. First, Vance has gotten a lot of attention, much less, of course, since the other developments we'll talk about. Trump will not like him getting the limelight. Trump will not like him being the crown prince. Trump will not like people saying, Vance, with Vance, you get Trump without the predatory behavior towards women and the word salad coming out of his mouth. So he'll turn on him. The other thing is, I think Don Jr. will turn on him, because I think Don Jr., who I don't think is particularly bright, sees himself as
neither does Trump. Trump doesn't think Don is very bright either.
Right. So, but these guys are a bunch of vipers, and they will turn on each other. I think in the rivalry. On the assassination, the Trumpian grace lasted, 48 hours, maybe. Although we still don't know how it really affected. I mean, I don't think anybody knows how, that close a brush with death would affect somebody. But what I think will affect him, as I mentioned in the article, is in this respect, I think he will. There are not many respects in which he's normal. One respect in which he's normal is, like most presidents in their second term, he'll be thinking about history with a capital H. And, the issue will be, does he think that history will remember him fondly for exiting NATO? Or will his risk aversion, and he is risk averse in a number of ways, actually quite profoundly risk averse in some ways, cause him to pull back from that. Um, and again, I don't know. And look, the main thing I wanted just to kind of sort of wrap my attempt to salvage my self-respect, and possibly yours, is it's not that I really disagree fundamentally with the things you say. It is fundamentally, this was just a plea to say, maybe we don't know. Everybody breathe deeply.
I think the challenge for all of us, honestly, is going to be, to um, not kind of allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by the rhetoric, which in any presidential election is heated, and you can already see it coming, particularly with Biden's decision to withdraw and Kamala's wrapping up the nomination. You can just see a wave of racist, misogynistic stuff
Oh
coming
yeah.
from the Trump campaign. So the rhetoric's can be awful. I think the challenge for all of us is to like kind of crawl through all that slime, and keep our eyes on the real threats, the real challenges, which are real to democracy and to America's place in the world and to a traditional internationalist foreign policy, without overhyping it so that we actually lose credibility as we try to make the argument to people who might be persuadable, in the election. I do take issue, I think, Eliot, with your characterization of him being concerned about his legacy in second term. Here's why. You're right. All normal presidents, have been concerned that way, but he is definitely not normal in that sense. And the evidence I would adduce for that are these. One, he had no interest in a presidential library. I mean, he had interest in stealing documents and taking them to Mar-a-Lago, but he had no interest in creating a presidential library. They tried to get him interested in talking about that. Wouldn't talk about it. Had no interest in it. Um, you know, People implored him on January 6th, including his daughter, to think about his legacy while he was sitting there watching the insurrection go on. Moved him not one whit. And everything you read about him, all the biographies, Maggie Haberman, our friends Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, who've written, I think, really the best book on his presidency, but all of the books, Very Stable Genius, I Alone Can Fix It. You got a picture of a man who lives only in the moment. There is no past, which is why he can totally contradict himself, and there is no conception of the future. And so I think, yes, in a normal world, a second term president would be worried about his legacy. I think I don't think he would be, and I think actually he wouldn't think about it as his final term. He's already suggested, that the 22nd Amendment is a suggestion, not an injunction, and that he might try and go for a third term if he lives through it, if he's elected.
Yeah, I mean that's all possible. I mean, and as I said, with all these things, I don't know. I think on the presidential library, I think he was probably afraid he'd have to pay for some element of it or raise money for a purpose that doesn't seem to him good, because it's not paying off his legal bills. And as for thinking about his legacy in the middle of January 6th, I think he was so caught up in the emotions of the moment. I'm not sure that counts. I don't know. But he has had a brush with mortality. I think even if he gets in, the chance of him being able to run for another term, I mean, first it not be legal, but and I think he would get it would get blocked. But I think I suspect he'll come in knowing that this at some level in the kind of deeper recesses of his lizard brain, that this is not going to be going anywhere. I do maybe to kind of draw a line under it. To what you were saying about keeping focusing on what's really going on. I think that's really important, and it's it's important for two reasons. One is, I mean, and this is just for me a kind of a general principle of how I think about international affairs. You do pay attention to what people say. What people say is important. A large part of foreign policy is just speech. But there is something to the realist view, but you should also just look at behavior too, and take into account what the behavior tells you about what's going on. I mean, you have to do both, and I think too many people who think about international affairs focus solely on one or solely on the other, and you got to do both. But the other thing is, the coarsening of the tone. One thing that struck me um, this past week is how utterly graceless the Republicans were about Biden pulling out, including people who've known him for a long time. So, the decent thing to be would say, well, we hate everything about Biden's policies and so on. But, okay, we understand why he did it. We wish him, a happy retirement or something like that. I mean, that would have been the standard thing in any era. And instead, every last one was just kind of mean spirited and vicious.
Two exceptions, Mitt Romney
Of
and
course.
Liz Cheney.
Well, that's like the rhino duumvirate. I mean,
Yeah, right. There's
but
the last
like
two.
Mike Johnson, who is nominally a Christian gentleman, right? Who should be showing some kind of grace and love
You
and
can
mercy.
say that. I can't possibly comment.
Well, I mean, since I'm not one, I'm allowed to make the comment. As I understood what that entails, that means being gracious to those who hate you. And I mean, I've no such inhibitions, but there's nothing. There's no grace in that. It was just bile and means, and then they're gonna try to sue and these ridiculous lawsuits. I mean, I think they hurt themselves, which I'm glad about. But it's a warning.
We should talk about the assassination. You mentioned that in the piece, and we've already, I think, dispensed with, at least in the short term, how much it's changed his view of anything. But
I
it
just
was
want
a very,
anything to get off that article.
but it was a very serious event, and the seriousness has been underscored by, just before we came on, the resignation of the director of the Secret Service after a completely disastrous congressional hearing for her yesterday, when she was unable to answer even basic questions about the clear deficiencies. But let's kind of pull the lens back and talk a little bit about the assassination attempt itself. I mean, I will tell you what I found worrisome about it is, as somebody who lived, through 1968 and remembers it well. I think 1968 was arguably the closest the country came to having a kind of nervous breakdown, with the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, massive riots in most urban areas, a contentious and violent Democratic convention in Chicago in the summer of that year that led to what an independent commission later called a police riot against the demonstrators. Um, I was having moments of PTSD, honestly, flashbacks to that era. And, we've talked a lot on this podcast and others about the dangers of this, kind of violent rhetoric. And I think you're seeing that, begin to play out. And I found what I saw on, banging around on Twitter or X, afterwards, really worrisome. And then again yesterday, the state legislator who was introducing J.D. Vance, who said, if we lose this election, we're going to have a civil war to take back the country. And the kind of rhetoric that Trump used on January 6th, got to fight like hell or you're not going to have a country. I again, I don't want to catastrophize and say that we're on the, brink of a civil war, but, as you and I have discussed in the past, because both of us have been reading some in the history of the country in the 1840s, particularly the 1850s, the decade that led up to the Civil War, you see a lot of echoes in the public discourse. It's not now about a sectional dispute and slavery, but it's over important cultural issues, and it's a kind of urban, rural, coastal elite, flyover country divide, and it's very worrisome.
So I had a number of thoughts about it. I'll begin with the one you just mentioned. One of the things that was very disturbing. I guess I'll stipulate. I think there are a lot of nuts out there. This country is way too lax about guns,
Of course.
and so these things happen. There's no excuse for us not doing more to prevent them. The degree of paranoid conspiracy theories on both sides about this, that either this was all a sham, and to gain sympathy for Trump. And I heard that from people who I don't normally think of as lunatics. And of course, the Republican stuff as well.
Yeah, deep state, Biden ordered it,
Yeah. But there were three things that really hit me. And then I do want to get to the 1840s, 1850s comparison. The first, very mundane. You look at the Secret Service. Secret Service is clearly an overstretched organization. They have to protect more people. So what the hell are they doing chasing counterfeiters? Just as a student of bureaucracy and of the functioning of the U.S. government, you would have thought that somebody a while back would say, look, what you need is an organization that just focuses on protecting key people at the heart of the federal government. That's what they're supposed to do. And instead, they do have these other responsibilities, starting with dealing with counterfeiters. And the fact that that hasn't been changed and that nobody's really surfaced it or wrestled with it, it tells you something, unfortunately, about the difficulty that we have in fixing parts of our government. Even more seriously, I'm very glad the head of the Secret Service resigned. She should have resigned. But what disturbed me most was that when this happened, she refused to accept accountability. And I think she thought she was going to survive it. And this is
she should have resigned immediately. Right.
She should have immediately offered her resignation. If the president doesn't want to take it, that's up to him. But she should immediately say, this happened on my watch. It's the old Navy thing. That's the skipper of the ship. When the ship runs aground, even if he's not on the bridge or she's not on the bridge, there's that. The third big thing is the role of contingency in history. Literally 1 centimeter, maybe 2. Trump's head would have been blown off. I mean, that's what a 5.56 millimeter round from an AR-15 would do. I mean, half of his head would have been gone. We were that close. And then I quite agree with you. I think if he had been assassinated, then I think you really would have seen violence. I think there would be enough kind of MAGA crazies who would say this was, the Biden administration seeing that their guy was. And I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves of the role of contingency in all politics, including our politics. I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are, and I'm not sure. The 1840s, 1850s comparison, I think, is a bit forced. And the reason why is it's not that the divides aren't large. The divides are large and they're substantial. But fundamentally, the whole crisis of the Union was about slavery. That was an issue going back to the founding. It was the most fundamental kind of problem for a free republic. This is subtler, and on a lot of the big issues, actually, the divides are not as great as people think. So, let's take abortion. I mean, I did not like to see. Roe was a problematic ruling, but getting rid of it was more problematic to my mind. Too many people are going to suffer as a consequence of it. It's going to get worked through the political system. And as it gets worked through the political system, you see that actually the consensus in this country is some form of legalized abortion up to, something like European, the European laws of the 16 weeks, something like that is where you're going to end up. Or gay marriage is another one. I mean, in the same way that interracial marriage, which would have been a real hot button issue half a century ago, it is just not an issue now. Same thing is true of gay marriage, and I think it's not so much that there are these huge divides between what people want, although there is some of that. It's the crisis that we're in is more of a crisis, I think, of dislocation, of a world changing and all of us struggling to deal with it. And for people like you and me and our families, it's easier for us to adjust than for a lot of other people to adjust. And those dislocations will continue as AI, among other things, as AI is going to do in a lot of white collar jobs, as well as it's no longer just going to be blue collar jobs.
I don't disagree, and and you're quite right, of course, that slavery was a much different issue than what we're dealing with now, and much more fundamental. And I don't mean to gainsay that at all. When I say it reminds me of the 1850s in particular, it's more because of the nature of the rhetoric and the way it gets expressed. Because, you know, so in the 1850s, you had Southerners who believed there was an abolitionist conspiracy to destroy their peculiar institution, and no amount of Lincoln, who was clear that he was not in favor of doing that, didn't think he had the authority to do it under the Constitution. No amount of explaining that could stop them ultimately from seceding in 1861. On the other side, there was this notion that there was a slave power conspiracy,
which Lincoln believed in, by the way.
Right. And that, that the slave masters were conspiring to spread slavery to the North. And of course, because of Kansas, Nebraska, there was, enough reality behind that a lot of people, became free soilers because of it. My point is, it's really more about a mode of expression, for dealing with political issues that has now become very current and has been in our history from the beginning. Gordon Wood writes about this at the time of the Revolution, anti-Mormonism, anti-Masonism. I mean, this kind of stuff has coursed through our body politic, nativism. It's been a part of the warp and woof of our history, but it's coming back now in a very big way, and that's really what I was getting at. And it's associated with political violence.
Yeah, and I mean, to reinforce that, it means because of the coarsening of the debate and the mores, there's more room for political violence. I think the way in which I really would agree with you is think about the beating of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks in the U.S. Senate, where some people may know. I mean, Preston Brooks comes over, and Sumner, who was a tall man, was sort of jammed into his desk, and he's just beating him with a cane. A guy who can't defend himself. So it's not like these are fisticuffs or something like that. This is beating of somebody who is defenseless. And it wasn't just that Brooks, who was a scoundrel, did that. It's that people all over the South said, "Oh, that's great," and they began sending him gift canes. So I agree. One book that if you and I ever decide to do, a series of revisiting the classics, which actually I think might not be a bad idea. The Paranoid Style in American Politics by Richard Hofstadter.
Yeah, I was thinking about that essay actually as we were talking. I mean, Gordon Wood's written his essay on conspiracy theorizing in the Revolutionary era. Hofstadter's essay, and also David Davis's essay on themes of counter-subversion in American history, which is where the anti-Masonism and the anti-Mormonism and anti-Catholicism all, in the 19th century were part of that. So yeah, I think we're in a very perilous moment. And one of the things that I really disliked about the Republican convention was the degree to which I think, they had an awful lot of people saying a lot of very irresponsible stuff. And the whole hyper masculinity that it embodied, I thought, was potentially potentially, feeding, pouring gasoline on what is already a smoldering fire in American society.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the person who I follow on all this is David French at the New York Times, because I think he understands that culture from the inside, as it were, and um, it's a somewhat useful corrective, I think, because I mean, I remember he wrote one column which was quite interesting about going to a Trump rally. He said, people are there to have a good time. Um, and they view this as a kind of entertainment. So it's not, he said that people have the idea that, you go to one of these rallies and it's like Orwell's 2 Minute Hate in 1984. He said, that's not what it's like. This is kind of a, but in any case, maybe but
Well, before we leave that thought, I mean, that is like an atavistic throwback to the 19th century when politics was entertainment.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
torchlight rallies and all that kind of stuff in
yeah.
the 19th century. There was no television. There was no radio. Politics was, in fact, a form of entertainment. And this is, I think, a kind of throwback to that.
And particularly also because Trump, if there's one thing Trump is, he's an entertainer.
Yeah.
And he's good at it. His skills, as I've often said, are few and narrow, but deep. And
that showed up at the convention, which I thought was clearly meant to be an entertainment product.
Yeah, and it worked. I mean, I began to get nauseous pretty early on each evening, so I didn't watch the whole show. But you could see that. Okay, so we have to talk about the real big news. Biden finally does the right thing after.
Hat tip to Bill Kristol, who's been arguing for that, our Bulwark colleague, for 2 years.
I've only been arguing it for a bit longer than a year, but I'll always defer to Bill. It is. We should talk about Kamala Harris and what she would be like. I do have to say, one thing I find interesting listening to some of the commentary in the news, but also sort of on the Democratic side, the anger at a lot of the staff, even to some extent at Biden himself, and some of the Democratic leadership for saying, no, he's fine. He's fine, just as sharp as, physical age doesn't mean anything. I think there is, and in this sense, this may be part of the populist moment where people say, don't lie to us like that. By the way, I think that will cut against Trump too, because as a number of people have pointed out, Trump is actually old. Trump is visibly aging, and some of this is going to turn on him. It's happened. I think once he decided to bail out, it was going to be Kamala, unless he had decided what he should have decided, which is, I'm going to be a one-term president, get the country through this. I mean, it's sad, because then I think his legacy would have been quite secure. I have to say, even though I've got some reservations about her, there are other Democrats I would have preferred to see in there. I think she actually has a pretty good chance of winning. What about you?
I think she has a chance of winning, and I think that's an improvement over where we were before Sunday, because I thought Biden had no chance of winning. And the reason I thought Biden had no chance of winning was in poll after poll after poll from the summer of 2021 on. The polling was pretty dispositive. People thought he was too old to serve a second term. And everything else was filtered, through that. I mean, the polls also showed they had a lot of, concern about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, about inflation, about immigration, about crime, all of those things. But in the end of the day, age was the most important issue. And the reason why Biden couldn't recover from the debate, in my view, was because the debate actually just validated what voters already believed,
right,
in massive numbers, which is that he's too old. He can't do this. We can go on and we can question about like how long has he been like this, how rapid has been his decline. My sense is actually he's been declining for the better part of a year, but that there's been a pretty sharp decline in the last several months. You kind of see that in his appearances and what he's
I've seen that with aging relatives and
of
friends,
course all of us.
as I'm
All,
sure you have as well. That people are there. There's kind of a sort of a gentle slope and then a steeper slope.
and that's one reason why. I mean, in the end of the day, this was the cunning, Hegel's cunning of history. They wanted to have an early debate to reset where the election was,
They did.
and it did, but not the way they intended. So anyway, I think she's got a chance. I was encouraged by her, her speech yesterday in Wilmington, and I gather she gave a great one today in Milwaukee as well. I think she needs to lean into her background as a prosecutor, and both in order to, as she put it yesterday, prosecute the case against Trump, but also to convince voters that she's tough enough to be, president of the United States. And I think because it's a very tough job, and I think, fairly or unfairly, I think women are held to a different standard, and I think this is really something she's got to do. Yeah, she didn't do that when she ran in 20. She kind of ran away from that background because people were telling her in the modern Democratic Party, or consultants or political consultants were telling her, you can't run as a cop, who put away drug dealers in the modern Democratic Party. Well, she's now going to be the nominee, so she doesn't have to worry about that, and she needs to really, I think, lean into it as she did yesterday. I've talked to people who briefed her in the 2019 cycle, friends of ours on the Democratic side, all pretty moderate centrist, Dems, who basically said, look, she's at that point, that was, 5 years ago, so it's a little bit dated, but that her instincts were kind of very tough-minded on foreign policy. And they said, as you would expect from someone who's been a prosecutor,
Mm-hmm.
and who's prosecuted malefactors, and so I think that, she's got a kind of instinct or disposition that is probably going to be pretty sound on most issues. But a lot's going to depend on who's around her. And we know that, Phil Gordon is her national security advisor. Her first national security advisor was actually Nancy McEldowney, who I had worked with in the Foreign Service, and it actually was briefly my deputy in Ankara when I was ambassador, before she went on to become ambassador to Bulgaria. But she gave way to Phil, who was her deputy, and Phil is now the national security advisor. I've got plenty of qualms and criticisms of Phil, but he's by and large a kind of centrist Democrat. Here's what I worry about. I worry about what you're going to get is more or less a continuation of the current Biden approach and policies, which means on Ukraine it's going to continue to be an effort at escalation management and not overreaching, and similar across the board, and that well, the good news is you and I will have plenty to criticize and lots of grist for our podcast.
I think that's right. I'm if anything, a bit more optimistic about her. First, I think it's pretty clear she's doing exactly what you said she should do, which is lean into the prosecutorial thing. And it's such a perfect fit for Trump. I've gone after sexual predators. Guess who's a sexual predator? I've gone after crooked businessmen. Let's, guess who's a crooked businessman? And
people who've run fraudulent, for-profit universities.
Right. I mean, that it fits like a glove. She will, if there's a debate, she'll mop the floor with him. I mean, because he is.
I'm not sure he'll debate her.
He may not, but I mean, the age contrast will be there, and I'm sure the Democrats will find a way to bring it out. It's interesting that it used to be the line that the Democrats fall in love, the Republicans fall in line. I think what's happening now is the Democrats are definitely falling in line. And to some extent, they're falling in love. I mean, the burst of enthusiasm, of money, of everybody signing up. And she, unlike in the primaries, in the last time around, she doesn't really have to worry about her left flank. I mean, she doesn't. There's no chance that AOC and the squad are going to say no. We'll sit this one out and let Trump win. I mean, the Democrats are so terrified of Trump, not unreasonably, that they will all line up behind her, whatever she says. And I think on top of all that, Trump is not going to know how to deal with her. I mean, he will undoubtedly revert to the kind of nasty, abusive, misogynist rhetoric, and
You can see it coming.
You can see it coming, and a lot of people are not going to like that. It'll remind them of everything they dislike. She'll be obviously not crazy, obviously sensible. I further think, if she picks somebody like Mark Kelly or Josh Shapiro, either one, but probably Kelly even more, the contrast with Vance will be striking, because Vance, he's got a baby face anyway, beard or no beard, and he's kind of a wacko because he feels he has to be. I mean, my view of JD, by the way, I view Vance as a particularly contemptible character because he's smart enough to know better. He has no principles whatsoever. He will do anything to cozy up to Trump. And so the people who know better, the knuckleheads I disregard. Somebody who's smart, I mean, this is just corrupt.
Yeah, Vance, in my view, is a total and complete phony. And if there's one thing that voters can sniff out, it's inauthenticity.
Yeah, and I think that'll come out. I think this was supposed to be a master stroke, and it won't be. As for the basic point, I tend to agree with you. I think it will be. I mean, as I said in the article, it'll be continuity with a somewhat different cast of characters. It'll be interesting to see if she wins with what sort of cabinet it is. I mean, precisely because she can't hold on to staff, among other things, and it's not like she's been in politics so long that she has a lot of allies. She's going to have to reach, I think, for people of stature for her cabinet, which is frankly not, Biden went for staff. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Democrat who's actually been high up in government. He said, the people around Biden staff him, but they do not serve him, or they don't serve him well. Well, she and Biden, this was one of his greatest faults, I think, is he surrounded himself with staffers. I don't think she's going to surround herself with staffers because she doesn't have that same kind of set of relationships. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. What I think we won't get, which unfortunately I think we need, is somebody who kind of looks at the world situation and says, oh my God, there are a whole bunch of things coming together here which could be calamitous. And we do have to think about things like, bumping up defense spending to 3.5%, maybe even 4% of GDP. And really take
higher.
Okay, see, all you
You're
folks listen,
squish.
I'm the moderate. But that I think we won't get.
Look, if we're facing a challenge, as I think both you and I believe, is the greatest challenge we've faced since 1945, that it's a global challenge. It's on the order of the scale of World War II, with Russia, China, North Korea, Iran all working together more and more closely. Then we need a level of effort that's at least what we did in the Cold War.
Yeah.
When we routinely spent 5 to 6% of GDP on average.
So maybe the way to sum it up is FDR. She's not, but she's not Huey Long, and she's not Henry Wallace.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. All right. Anything else? We're coming up on time.
Last time I let you see any of the articles I write.
It's all offered in the spirit of love and fraternal affection.
Oh yeah, as I mop up the blood. Go ahead.
Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Shielded Republic. We'll be back next week with a very interesting book. I'll just tease that to the audience. And Eliot, please keep writing in the Atlantic. I promise to be kinder in the future.
Nah, don't. It would be boring if you did. And despite all the jokes, I enjoy it.